I mean, when you take institutional venture capital, you're on the clock. Once there's mutual interest, what I like to do is say, look, let's just put all that aside. Let's pretend the deal got done. Congratulations, we bought the company, like we're one company. Now let's sit in a conference room for a couple hours and just whiteboard. What would that look like?
If you want to be rich, you take in outside money and then you make the trade-offs. But if you want to control it, you take in less input and you build differently. Very few people are both rich and king.
There's no such thing as, in my opinion, as a good founder. There's only a good founder for a specific idea.
I don't know that you can create charisma where none exists. But what you can do is be authentic.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Ben King, again, founding managing partner of Glendon Advisors. I'll be moderating the session today. As mentioned, we have Spencer Raskoff, who's been a prolific, serially successful entrepreneur, who also has a fund as well here, has served on the board of growth companies such as Palantir, Match, and other companies. We also have here with us Professor Elisa Grossman, who runs the Lloyd Greif Center for Entrepreneurship at the USC Marshall School of Business. And finally, we have Dominic Perry, partner with Vertex Ventures, also advisor to Altitude Cyber, who's also held various corporate development roles in tech companies as well. So again, our topic today is from founding to full scale, navigating the path to an exit. I want to start off the panel today by opening it up first to talk about what founders, prospective founders, or early stage founders should think about, even in terms of the exit from the very beginning and in the early stages. And so what I would like to do is open it up to the panel here and to provide perspectives on, from the beginning, what should founders think about? For Spencer, looking back, what would you tell young Spencer in the early innings to do differently as a founder? For Elisa, her perspective as well, having worked with a lot of young entrepreneurs and founders, as well as Dominic too, who's been an early stage VC investor for several years. So over to the panel.
It's a great topic and not talked about enough among founders. So I encourage companies I'm involved in and founders that I advise to make an acquirer list and create a spreadsheet, and every month you should be trying to network, trying to talk to different people at those acquirers, because if you wait until it's time to sell your company, it's too late. When I was running Zillow for 15 years, we bought 17 companies. And the median time from when there was the very first CEO to CEO meet to when we actually closed that acquisition 17 times was about 2 years. So it takes a long time, a long courtship to get to know potential acquirers, from corp dev to finance to strategy to operations to the C-suite to sometimes the board. And so you have to build those relationships over long periods of time. You have to be very intentional about it. And good founders allocate 5, maybe 10% of their time to that type of networking with strategic acquirers, because you never know when those relationships are going to become important.
You stole my answer.
Sorry.
I really did have that in mind. I think that of course, I come from the educator perspective. We talk often about sort of 2 buckets. One is to think very, very early, perhaps even before day one, about what sort of a culture you want to build in your organization, what sort of an organization you want to have. That informs who you're going to bring on and how you want the company to actually operate, which can help drive success toward a more positive result. And I think in the other bucket, I had 2 things. Sort of number one, what is your job? We spend a lot of time trying to remind founders that your job is to build a great business and not get distracted by the other things, that the other things come if you build a great business, and it can be easy to take your eye off the ball. But finally, to be prepared for the sale as early as the very, very beginning, because you never know when someone's going to show up at your door asking, and if you're not ready, if you don't have all the documentation ready, you don't have your, if you have a cap table already, if you don't have that sort of down on lock, if you don't have all of the paperwork and everything ready, then it can take 4 to 9 months to put all of that stuff together and be ready for a sale. So you can miss the opportunity when it arrives at your door if you're not thinking about it from the very, very earliest stages.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, relationships and readiness is core to all exits. I think, I guess the only other thing I would add is maybe from a macro standpoint is like what's going on in the M&A environment. We're coming off of a pretty horrendous 2023. We were, in terms of deal value, we were down to 2013 levels. So we actually went backwards 10 years on the heels of what we went through with COVID. The good news is the sort of M&A drought is over. You're seeing now we're on pace for $500 billion in deal value. So we're now back at the 2019 level, which is great. So just before COVID, when things were, on the up and up. Look, 1% of exits are IPO. It's a very small club, and 99% is getting acquired by a larger incumbent, whether it's a financial buyer or a strategic. So, preparing is really important. It's not that you're trying to sell your company in the first year of founding it, but understanding what's going on at the macro, understanding what acquirers are looking for, and building those relationships with your dance partners is a smart thing to do. And if you're not going to do it, know that your competitor's likely doing it and they're getting on their radar. And if you're not doing it, I think you're sort of doing yourself a disservice. But again, I would say a small percentage of your time. I'm not saying you should do this all day long, but yeah, I think that's pretty spot on.
Yeah. So as a follow-up and kind of moving sequentially along the founding and then growing chain of a small enterprise, moving also from the beginning, thinking about the exit, which also should certainly impact one's business plan as well, in terms of looking at the market and the business that you're creating and scaling. Next up for a founder, of course, is you have this idea, you're bootstrapping perhaps, and then you're thinking about bringing on external financing and capital. So talking about raising capital, for the panel here, in each of your unique experiences, what are the key characteristics that are most compelling either for you to invest, both Dominic as well as Spencer, who are venture investors, as well as what has made you successful fundraising throughout your life cycle as an entrepreneur, and also more broadly, what are the hallmarks or reliable indicators of being able to raise successfully and get that first 1 to 2 rounds of critical capital in the door?
I'll touch on from an early stage investor perspective, we're often the first money into a company, so there's not a lot of metrics to go off of. We're going off of the problem you're solving, the market, and you, the founder. In the early days, I guess if you were, since we've been in kind of this capital efficient kind of mode the last few years and not growth at all costs, yeah, we would look at like logo velocity. How are you getting your customers? Are they churning? What does that growth look like? Again, it's really, really early in your first 1 to 2 million ARR. But outside of that, it's the founder. I think the market and the problem speaks for itself. I think we have conviction around that, and we are talking to other founders solving that problem in addition to you. So what's going to stand out is you and how you think, how the vision for the company, how you're going to solve this big sort of hairy problem that you're working on, and sort of the vision for the company. So help us create that conviction to back you.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, totally agree. At the early stage, it's about the founder, but it's also about the founder product fit. So there's no such thing as in my opinion, as a good founder. There's only a good founder for a specific idea. If you had asked me to create, we were talking backstage about cyber, a category I don't know very well, I'm just not fired up about solving problems in cyber. I don't jump out of bed excited about that. I don't think I'd be a very good founder in those spaces, but other things that I am fired up about work really, that I think I am a good founder. So I remember one startup I invested in, I asked the founder at the pitch, I said, what would you do if I told you you couldn't solve this problem? Like for whatever reason, you just can't pursue this. And he just looked at me like I was crazy. He's like, you understand, I wake up every morning trying to figure out how to solve this problem. I go to sleep every night. It's all I think about. I would do this for free. I was put on earth to solve this problem. And I'm like, okay, that's exactly what I want to hear at that stage. And then the other thing I'd add, which I think is not talked about enough, is charisma and sales ability from the founder. So we talk a lot about technical ability and sort of the persona of the technical genius sitting there in his or her hoodie coding all night long and how important that is in a founder. But a lot of the time, founders are selling. They're selling their business to VCs, to candidates that they're recruiting, to their own employees, to their parents or their spouses or partners who are like, why don't you get a real job that actually pays salary? Like, what are you doing? And so you're constantly explaining and pitching and trying to convince people that the mission that you're on is a good mission and they should support you in one way or another. So charisma and sales ability is really important for a founder, and I think it doesn't get discussed enough.
If I could just add to that, I come out of a business school environment, so we deal with so many different founders. And one of the things we've found in business schools is that historically business schools tend not to teach about sales that much. And so we've had this conversation very, very often about, but this is so critical to what happens. And so I don't mean this in a tooting our own horn way, though it's going to sound that way. So we actually introduced a Selling for Founders course at the undergraduate level a few years ago, and it's been so successful that we're introducing one at the MBA level this year. And the emphasis there, I don't know that you can create charisma where none exists, but what you can do is be authentic. And so a lot of the course isn't just about these sort of mechanical, quantitative tools of sales pipelines, but rather about how do you realize your authentic self and be that founder who fits with that product in a way that's compelling to people who are listening.
Yeah, no, and I would agree in terms of overall experience. I think this can be particularly challenging for highly technical founders because it's a different skill set. And so, again, these are things that are skills that are very important, but they're not necessarily taught inherently in our educational system or elsewhere, and it's part of the growth process, right?
I think it's getting, I don't have to go too far down this rat hole, but I think it's getting worse, like generationally, because younger people are very used to just sitting behind their keyboard or in their smartphone, and getting out from behind your desk and trying to pitch and sell and meet with customers and explain how you're going to solve their problems. It doesn't come naturally to a lot of people, especially young people.
Yeah, you can tell this is a Gen X plus panel right here, everyone.
Yeah. Or decide to hand the reins over to someone. If you're going to be the technical founder, be the chief product officer or CTO, bring in a charismatic CEO that can do all of the, be the face of the company, if you will. And that's happened a lot. Obviously, look at Google as an example, right? They stepped aside and brought in a professional CEO. That worked out pretty well for them.
Yeah, no, and that's I've seen this a lot too. That's something as an early stage founder you have to have your eyes wide open on because it's very hard, right? This is something that you as a founder have created out of nothing essentially, but there will potentially be a point in time where you may have to move roles. And of course, the old venture adage, right, is venture capitalists are looking for the right horse in the right race with the right jockey. But as that race continues, the jockey may need to be changed. So moving on from here, in terms of, raise capital, obviously for founders, just getting external financing in the first couple of rounds in is a major, major focus and a huge hurdle. But that said, once you raise capital, and especially as you move into fundraising from, at an institutional level. And by that, I mean even just an early stage VC as opposed to safe rounds or angel type of investors. That funding and that financing, it comes with its own set of strings. So I'd love to hear from the panel just a little bit more texture around that too, in terms of both on the venture investor side, board side, founder side, what one can expect.
I mean, when you take institutional venture capital, you're on the clock. Like immediately, first of all, you work for someone else, at least to some extent. You work for the VCs, but they expect and demand an exit. And so this sort of ties back to the very first conversation about M&A. I think it's very important for founders to be realistic about what the potential outcome is for their business and make sure that they're capitalizing it to that extent. Because there are tons of good ideas out there that are companies that could be 5, 10, 20, 30, $50 million businesses. And that's awesome. I mean, if you owned all of a company that was worth 20 or $50 million, like that would be amazing, right? Or if you own most of it. And but when you capitalize it with venture capital, the VCs expect a return of 3 to 10x, and they have a portfolio approach. So they want you to swing for the fences, and they are okay with a 0 as long as there's a chance of a really big exit. And so it's a different mentality than you as a founder might have, where where you might want a different outcome that you could optimize for with a different capital structure.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of benchmarks out there for what great looks like. If you're a Series A company that raised X amount in whatever space, there's a whole cohort of companies that are killing it. And so you sort of know where that watermark is. I'm sure you know about the rule of 40, which is being applied to a lot of public companies today, but even private as well. That's sort of now the new watermark for, what great looks like and what's going to attract investors and and drive more liquidity. So, there's if you're a SaaS company, there's tons of really great growth investors out there that have all these different reports. Like, Scale Ventures has a good one. So a few others. I think Iconic publishes a really great report as well. So it's all there for you to see in terms of where these companies are performing. And when you raise that kind of money, the investors sort of put that pressure on you, right? They're like, well, look at these companies. They're crushing it. Like, why aren't we there? So that's kind of something you're going to have to deal with when you raise that kind of money.
Yeah, no, and then, I'd like to go to Elisa here, because she mentioned something I think really interesting at the beginning in terms of early stage and what's important in terms of culture and team. And so, Elisa, you've worked directly as well as running the Greif Center with many students and early stage founders. And as you take on capital, obviously, part of being a founder and also how that impacts culture and team can change. And so, I was wondering if you had anything to add just in terms of the dynamics and how you prepare students or young founders to think about that.
We talk a lot about students understanding the rules of engagement based on who they're going to partner with or who's going to ultimately be their investor. As Spencer said, any venture-backed company, the rule of engagement is you're headed for an exit. And so part of that is I think building a team and understanding as you head toward whatever the rules are of the person who you're seeking or the entity that you're seeking. We teach the students to try to be, and I mean this with sensitivity and with the intentionality of empathy, though it doesn't sound that way. You have to be very efficient in getting rid of the teammates who aren't going to be good for your business. I've worked with many founders who have gotten rid of people at exactly the right time. Few do it too early, and usually they do it too late. And so part of it is teaching people to do that. And part of it is also about self-awareness, having the founder know who they are. And we had a faculty member at USC for some time. He's now the dean of the business school at Yeshiva University in New York. His name is Noam Wasserman, and many of you or some of you may have read his book on founders' dilemmas. And he talks about the fundamental conflict of, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king, which isn't meant in a sexist way. Do you want to be ruler? He says founder. And the truth is, there's many people who want to control their destiny, and that means you don't take as much outside input in the short term. Then you're the king. Then you're the ruler. No, I got it backwards. If you want to be rich, you take in outside money, and then you make the trade-offs. But if you want to control it, you take in less input and you build differently. Very few people are both rich and king. There are a few out there, but very few.
I have a friend who has had 3 venture-funded exits in healthcare tech and has done really, really well. And what he's doing now after his 3rd exit is he got a $500,000 small business loan and $500,000 that he put towards $1 million purchase of a pool cleaning company, which he paid 1 times cash flow for or something. And he picked up 300 pool cleaning clients. And he has a plan now. He's not going to raise any outside capital. He has a plan to expand this to add all sorts of other home services and basically roll up LA and Southern California home services businesses. It is a much, much smaller swing. I mean, if he's successful, this company is going to be worth 20 million or 40 million or 60 million, but he owns all of it. He's optimizing for lifestyle. He walks 2 blocks to work. He answers to no one. And he's just like, look, I did the venture funded thing and I knew how to play that game and I did it well, but it's a lot and it's different. And at this stage of my life, I want this. So this is a ruler versus rich. Like he's trying for both in 2 different stages of his life.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great, set of observations here. Especially, I've personally been in this situation too, where I've come in with venture money in the C-suite, and my mandate's been to be a change agent, essentially, for a founding team. And part of what's really hard is sometimes you have to let people go, and that's not fun to do. The kind of again, another proverbial adage is slow to hire, fast to fire. Now that sounds kind of inhumane or insensitive, but that said, it is a true axiom in terms of this and being able to be successful and evolve. Let's pivot now towards after some amount of scale and talk more specifically about heading towards an exit. Positioning for an exit, and also the methods of exiting. First off, just to open it up, what's the right time to attempt an exit? How do you go about it? And how to be ready for an exit?
It's really hard to time, like anything in life. I think market dynamics is a huge factor. As I mentioned earlier, I think right now you have some tailwinds. We're entering sort of an M&A super cycle, which I think is how Goldman described it recently. And the numbers show that as well. So that can sort of give you confidence that now is a good time to do it. Workday just acquired one of our companies called Eversort just a few weeks ago. It was a contract management company, really great exit for the founder and for us. Again, sort of goes back to planting the seeds early. I think if you haven't built those relationships with those dance partners and you get, let's say, an inbound interest, like that's great, but then you're kind of starting cold with all these other, sort of potential acquirers that you're trying to build relationships with. And it's just not that easy when you're, sort of talking to someone for the first time. It's like, oh, hey, I have this, offer in hand and they want to acquire us. Are you interested? Whereas if you could have built that relationship a year, in advance and give them some updates on the company, that relationship is already warm. So I think, the relationship aspect is big. And I guess the question was, what else you can do to prepare for an exit?
Yeah, both timing and how to go about it, and also how to be ready.
I was going to address the timing point, and this is going to sound like very common sense. A really good point to pursue acquisition is when you're doing well and you can command an attractive purchasing price and when people are interested in buying you. And it could be that you're doing well, but your team is tired. And that means it's a good time to go. It's sort of a more micro level response. The very earliest people in a startup are not fungible. They often are extraordinarily talented people who are critical to the endeavor. When it gets bigger, it's easier to replace people, but it's very difficult at the early stages. And of course, if the offer isn't attractive enough, you have the option of remaining independent. And then the other, I think time is right, is when you're not doing well. And you're going to run out of money. And then of course, it's going to be a lot more difficult to find someone, but that's when you really have to. And you have to start early, not when you're really close to running out of money. Otherwise, you'll run out of money before you do the deal. But you're going to be trying to find the targets who will, hopefully you've heeded Hans Spencer's advice and you already have the list of targets. You're going to be looking at probably the people in the product side of a company, not necessarily the biz dev people, the people who are going to get the deal done, who have P&L responsibility. Hopefully you have an advocate inside of the company, someone who can vouch for strategic fit.
I think founders sometimes forget about all the incremental dilution and the time that you're from the other path not taken. So let's say you're a Series A company and you raised whatever, 10 at 50 in your Series A. And someone comes along and you think you could potentially sell the business for 75 million or 100 million. And you're thinking to yourself, well, I could probably do the Series B at 200 million, the Series C at 600 million, the Series A, et cetera. Like, all that might be true, but each of those new venture rounds is going to be 10 to 20% more dilution and push out the exit by another 1 to 2 years. So the $100 million sale today with no more dilution, you own X% of the company, versus the IPO maybe 6 years from now, by which point, take your equity and do times 0.9, times 0.9, times 0.9, times 0.9, and then you have to wait 2 or 3 years before you can start selling your shares on the other side of an IPO, if you even get that far. Like, that's how you have to think about it. And a lot of people just think about the headline number. They're like, oh, this is less than what I could raise the next venture round out. And they forget about all the incremental dilution. I'll just tell my M&A story. I've only sold one company that I was the founder of, and that was Hotwire. So we started Hotwire in 1999, and in 2001, after 9/11, after September 11th, there was a huge travel recession. People didn't travel, and so the company was on the ropes. We did layoffs, down round. It was just a terrible, terrible time for the company. And by 2003, 2 years later, the company was doing well again. And we were on a path to potentially go public. And Expedia reached out to us and said, we want to talk about M&A. And so, we were in this position thinking through, okay, how do we think about selling the company versus potentially going it alone? And we ended up accepting the offer from Expedia for about $700 million. And one of the main reasons we accepted it was we were really worried that if we turned that offer down, stayed independent, tried to go public, that Expedia was going to come into our space, which was the discount travel space, and compete with us. So this is another thing that startups need to really think about. If you spurn an M&A offer from a strategic that's much larger from you, are they going to come into your space, or are they going to acquire another competitor, and then all of a sudden your competitive position, your path to the Series B, C, D, E, IPO, et cetera, isn't quite as clear as you think it might be today.
I think that's a really good point. In fact, the reference too about a dual process has happened to me in one of the venture-backed companies I ran. That we had that very dilemma about, do we raise a Series B or do we try to sell? And we engaged in a dual process. And that, as you're hearing, it's a complicated calculus about what the right thing to do is in terms of exiting versus raising more. And to pivot off of that, in terms of the actual types of exits, there's really three basic varietals. There's the strategic acquirer, there's the financial buyers like private equity firms and the like, and then there's the IPO. I'd like to invite the panel to comment on each of those three routes, the pros and the cons of what each of those involve to some degree. Let's start with strategic acquisitions because that's the majority of them.
Well, one thing to consider with strategic M&A is the culture fit between the two companies, and you rightly alluded to this already. But I remember when we at Zillow, we bought a company called .loop, and .loop was sort of DocuSign for real estate. So about half of all residential real estate transactions use .loop for electronic signature and transaction management. And when we were talking, I was meeting with the founder to consider buying the company. I was like, what do you care about? Why are you, what are your priorities? And he said, I just really want to digitize real estate transactions. I think it's crazy that people still use pen and paper and they're signing documents on the hood of a car. And my mission in life is to switch all real estate transactions to be totally digital. And it was a great culture fit because I was able to convince him that if they sold to Zillow, we could accelerate their mission, that their 100 employees, all of whom were super fired up about digitizing real estate transactions, would be more likely to achieve that mission, that goal in life, more quickly as part of our company. And that was good strategic fit, also good culture fit because the values of the two companies were really closely aligned. I think I said we did 16 or 17 acquisitions. The biggest failed acquisition that we did was a $50 million deal of a rental technology company that we bought. And it was a failure because the founders just viewed it as an exit. They're like, okay, we got our $50 million, we're done. They didn't really care about the mission of what they were doing. They didn't care about it being successful on the other side of the transaction. And it was the worst acquisition that we did because there wasn't value alignment or mission alignment between the acquirer and the acquired.
Yeah, I think IPO and strategic acquisitions is definitely a premium in the industry. I think we look at that as that's the ideal outcome. One of those on the financial sponsor or things like a private equity exit. It's not to say that it's a bad thing, but typically the multiples are a little less than a premium buy with a strategic or obviously with an IPO. That's changed a little bit. There's just explosion of software companies in the last few years. There's 1,200 software companies out there, whereas 4 years prior to that, that number was like a quarter of that. Private equity platforms, as they say, have entered the tech game in the last 5-6 years in a big way. There's now 16, maybe more than that, of platforms that they've acquired that are worth $10 billion or more. 4 years prior to that, there were only 4. So they've got these big software companies that they're either taking private or acquiring, and then they're sort of bolting on all these other acquisitions, which as a founder could be a good outcome. They're taking much more of a financial lens to these acquisitions, which their plan is to either roll it up into something bigger or package it up and sell it in 3 to 4 years. So it's kind of the opposite of a strategic acquisition. So ideally, if it was me, I'd like to go the Spencer route and sell to a strategic and get a premium. But going the route of private equity is not so bad either. And then the other one benefit, I'll close with that comment, is sometimes you can actually stay on and continue running the business. And if they take like a majority acquisition of the company, they'll let you run it, and then you may actually have an exit 2 or 3 years later. So in essence, you would have 2 exits, which is actually not bad. So in some ways, it actually could result in a premium exit in and of itself.
You and I were speaking earlier, Ben, about the fact that from an investor side, an IPO is an attractive exit. You spoke about the small odds. I think the average number of IPOs each year in the United States is around 220. So very, very few companies go to IPO, but many, many startups, going back to thinking at the beginning, very, very few. A lot of people talk about the excitement and the allure and the luster of an initial public offering, but founders spend a lot of time thinking about going public. They don't actually think about being public. And so from the founder side, it's not really an exit. You're going in for the long haul. You're staying in the business. Your team is staying in the business. It's really a fundraising event. It's a liquidity event. So I don't know that I actually think of it from the founder side as an exit. The other ways, you have the ability potentially to stay on with the company. And so, or rather, I'm sorry, I keep flipping what I'm saying. I can't see anybody. It's very disconcerting. I'm used to teaching in a classroom with fluorescent lights. I do much better with that environment. But when you get acquired, often many of the people might leave eventually or within a certain period of time. So there's more of an exit with the acquisition approach.
Just one clarification that I mentioned earlier, the 1,200 software companies I mentioned were $1 billion or more valuation. There's obviously a lot more software companies out there, but at that unicorn status, there was about 1,200, whereas 4 years ago, there was only a quarter of that.
And I'm sure Spencer can speak to this, but when you have an IPO, it's a tremendous amount of paperwork. You can get stuck in small cap hell. It can be very difficult if you don't achieve a certain size to continue raising capital because their value is going to be variable and hinged to the market. It can have a roller coaster effect, not just on your company and the stakeholders, but on the culture. People get very happy when things are going well. People get very sad and demoralized when they're not going well. So there actually are a lot of downsides to an IPO aside from the excitement of the beginning.
Yeah, and of course, your financials are public. I mean, the IPO, I've referred to it as kind of the golden straitjacket proverbially, because all of a sudden, you're accountable to Wall Street every quarter with your financials. And in terms of the value and the long-term health of the business and the business models aren't always fully supported by being public in the sense of having to hit quarterly goals. That's why you see public companies go private if they're pivoting, for instance, from a perpetual software model to a SaaS model. But, Spencer, over to you, since you've experienced, and gone through and led through all these types of exits.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pros and cons have been covered. There's one other pro that maybe we haven't mentioned, which is the permanent access to capital. So once Zillow was public, we were able to raise capital whenever we wanted. I mean, if you're a late stage private company, you have to go do a venture funding round and it takes months and you're meeting with all these VCs. We could just sell equity or do a convertible debt offering. And we did that many times. We raised billions of dollars at Picasso once we were public. So that's great. It's like having an ATM machine and you just go and take money out of it whenever you want. Now you're diluting the shareholders, but you're selling more shares and raising more capital. And that was really valuable. There's one other thing that's sort of in between these two camps, which one of my companies, Picasso, is doing right now. there was a section of the Jobs Act about 10 years ago which created something called Reg A, or Regulation A, which lets companies sell shares to the public, to individual retail investors, but the shares don't trade. And so that's what Picasso is doing right now. So Picasso issues audited financials to the SEC twice a year instead of 4 times a year, like a regular public company reports quarterly. Picasso reports every 6 months. And we're selling up to $75 million, which is the maximum that Reg A allows, at a $750 million valuation. So Picasso's already raised $220 million of venture capital through Series C, but rather than doing another venture capital round, a Series D, we decided to do this kind of quasi-IPO where we're raising capital from individual investors. And the reason that we're doing that is Picasso's business is sort of democratizing access to second homes. We take luxury vacation homes and we fractionalize them. And so we're democratizing access to something that's most people don't have the ability to acquire, a luxury vacation home. And we're democratizing access to something most people don't have the ability to acquire, which is shares in a privately held venture-funded company. And so it's very consistent with our mission. So it's something sort of halfway between a late-stage growth round from a venture firm and an IPO.
Well, we're coming up on time here, so I'd like to kind of finish up with this last question to the panel. Obviously, also one of the difficult things is when you're involved in an exit, it's obviously incredibly intensive. And so, when I've been asked about my own experience, I mean, you have to be exceptionally good, your team, your product, you have to take yourself, and the team has to take themselves in terms of working so far beyond the limits you think you may have. Those are just table stakes. But then the third thing is you always need a little serendipity or luck or karma or whatever you want to call it to actually close a deal. And so I wanted to wrap with this for the panel in terms of asking each of you in terms of what you've seen, in that final inning, closing a deal, getting it across the line, and also as well for you, Spencer, being an operator and orchestrating that while still trying to run the business.
Yeah, I'll give you one real tactical suggestion that I've always done in these situations, which is when when the two parties are talking, frequently they get sort of tripped up on deal terms and valuation and governance and all this stuff. And once there's mutual interest, what I like to do is say, look, let's just put all that aside. Let's pretend the deal got done. Congratulations, we bought the company, like we're one company. Now let's sit in a conference room for a couple hours and just whiteboard, what would that look like? Like, where do we go from here? What's the first week? What's the first month? What's the next quarter? What's the 3-year plan? What's the go forward plan? Let's just map that out together. And usually that's 5 or 10 or 20 people potentially, depending upon the size of the companies. Once you start having that discussion and you talk about the shared vision and where the two companies can go together, it's incredibly easy to solve all the other up funnel issues around deal terms and valuation, et cetera, because everyone buys into that shared vision, and then you loop back privately, sort of CEO to CEO or board to board, on the deal terms, and I've found that to be a really effective way to break log jams in M&A situations.
I mean, the deal itself usually comes down to a couple of really key issues, obviously price being one of them. I would also say that it's incredibly time intensive. So as a CEO, get ready to essentially put everything aside and focus on this. This is going to be your every day and weeks for a while until the deal gets done. It's incredibly exhausting, and hopefully you end up with a good outcome. But be ready that it's going to take all of your time when you're actually in an active process. What else can I say? Yeah, I mean that's.
Have a good lawyer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, I should have did a little plug for myself. Like, get a good advisor.
Also, be able to manage the lawyers too. Having my background is JD MBA, and I've been through exits, but also make sure that the lawyers don't over-lawyer on terms that are, in the end, not make or break. Sorry, Lisa, you were going to say something to wrap us up.
I was just going to say a variation of what Spencer said, which is in the midst of negotiations and due diligence and all the things that happen that are so intensive, sometimes you can lose sight of what the actual job was. So going back to what I said at the beginning, your job is to run and build a great business. So the best way through is to keep doing that, keep running the great business.
Yeah, and don't punt too many things either to the post-close, like earnouts and things like that will inevitably be part of the deal, but it's going to be out of your control once the ink is dry. If a lot of your success is tied to performance and other metrics that, as part of this new big company you're part of, there's going to be a lot of things you can't control. If the deal closes and then eventually the CFO is like, "Oh, we're going to cut all your funding. We're going through a hard time, and sorry." You're not going to be able to achieve those goals, and that's going to severely give you a haircut on what you could have earned. So just be careful what you sign up for post-close, and just get a lot of that up front.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect way to close the full life cycle, the circle of life, so to speak, in terms of at the end, it still is run a good business. It's harder to do it during this process, but in the end, where it starts is where it finishes. So we're at time, but thank you so much, Spencer, Lisa, and Dom, for being here. This has been a fabulous panel, so it's an honor and privilege to be with all of you, and hopefully it's been informative for all of you out there in the audience, even though we can't see all of you.